Welcome to Concrete Block, the podcast where we dive into the latest news and current events shaping our world. I'm your host, Walter, and we're glad you're joining us today. As we navigate the complex landscape of international relations, geopolitics, and global conflicts, it's essential to stay informed and up to date on the issues that matter most. Today, we're focusing on the ongoing situation in Ukraine and the latest developments in the region. The conflict between Russia and Ukraine has been a major point of contention for years, with both sides accusing each other of aggression and provocation. Recently, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky called on European countries to increase pressure on Russia to end the conflict, while Russian President Vladimir Putin has maintained that his country's actions are justified and necessary for national security. In a speech at the Valdai Discussion Club, Putin emphasized that the responsibility for achieving peace lies with the European Union, accusing Western countries of hypocrisy and a desire for regional dominance. He also warned that Russia will respond decisively to any threats to its sovereignty and statehood. Meanwhile, U.S. President Donald Trump has authorized the provision of intelligence to Ukraine to strike energy infrastructure deep inside Russia, a move that could potentially escalate the conflict. It's a complex and delicate situation with multiple players and interests at stake. As we explore this story further, we'll aim to provide a balanced and nuanced perspective, considering the views and motivations of all parties involved. We'll examine the historical context, the current state of affairs, and the potential implications for global stability and security. We'll be right back with more of today's top news on Concrete Block. Welcome back to Concrete Block. I'm your host, Walter, and we're diving into our middle segment today. We've got a compelling story coming out of Madagascar, where a youth-led movement is taking the country by storm. The protests, which have been ongoing for several days, were sparked by water and electricity outages in the capital city of Antananarivo. Now, let's take a closer look at what's happening on the ground. The protesters, who are part of a group called Gen Z Madagascar, are demanding radical changes to the country's political system. They're calling for the resignation of President Andry Rajoelina, the dissolution of parliament, and an overhaul of the Electoral Commission. These demands are driven by concerns about corruption, poverty, and inequality, which have plagued Madagascar for years. It's worth noting that Madagascar is one of the poorest countries in the world, with an average annual income of just $545 per person. The country has also struggled with corruption, ranking 100 out of 180 countries in Transparency International's Corruption Perceptions Index. So, it's no surprise that young people are taking to the streets to demand change. The protests have been largely peaceful, but there have been reports of clashes between protesters and security forces. The government has accused some protesters of looting, while the protesters themselves claim that they've been unfairly targeted by authorities. What's interesting about this movement is the way it's been inspired by other youth-led protests around the world, particularly in Asia. Gen Z Madagascar has been learning from fellow activists in countries like Indonesia and Nepal, where similar movements have achieved significant successes. As we watch this story unfold, it's essential to consider multiple perspectives. While the protesters are driven by a desire for change, the government is also trying to maintain order and stability. It's a delicate balance, and one that requires careful consideration of the complex issues at play. We'll continue to monitor the situation in Madagascar and bring you updates as more information becomes available. In the meantime, we want to hear from you. What do you think about the protests in Madagascar? Should the government be doing more to address the concerns of its young people? Share your thoughts with us on social media using the hashtag #SuConcreteBlock. Stay tuned for our final story of the day, right here on Concrete Block. Welcome back to Concrete Block. We're coming down to the wire on today's show, and we've got a few more international headlines to dive into before we wrap up. It seems like there's been some movement in the world of global politics, with several key players making significant announcements. The UK and EU are reportedly close to striking a deal that would spare British businesses from a carbon border tax set to be introduced in 2026. This temporary exemption would likely be a welcome relief for companies that rely heavily on trade with the EU. Meanwhile, Tensions between Russia and Europe continue to escalate, with Moscow warning that it will target assets of Western companies operating in the country if the EU follows through on its plan to introduce a carbon border adjustment mechanism. The proposed loan would use cash accumulated from matured securities held in Euroclear, a Brussels-based central securities depository. In other news, the U.S. has disbursed $27 billion in loans to Ukraine, backed by profits from Russian assets. This move is seen as a significant show of support for the embattled Eastern European nation. It's also worth noting that the EU and UK are working towards aligning their carbon emission schemes, with a formal agreement expected to be reached in the coming weeks. This would likely have a positive impact on businesses operating in both regions. As we take a step back and look at the bigger picture, it's clear that global politics is a complex and ever-evolving landscape. With multiple nations and organizations vying for influence, it can be difficult to keep track of who's doing what and why. That's all for today's Concrete Block. Remember to like, share, and subscribe, and until next time, stay informed.